In this video, we will create an OIDC application that will be integrated into our Form.IO project, allowing our connected application to support OIDC authentication. The first decision to make before configuring your project for OIDC is choosing an OIDC provider. For this demonstration, we will be utilizing OneLogin. Start off by creating a new application within your provider. I'm going to search for OIDC and create a new OIDC app. The application configuration process will vary between providers. However, most will share a similar process, each of which require you to save the callback URL within the OIDC application configuration. My application is currently on localhost port 4200, so I'm going to add the redirect URIs and logout URIs. As mentioned, each OIDC provider should have you configure the callback URL, or it's sometimes referred to as the redirect URI. This will be the domain endpoint the OIDC user is redirected to after they have authenticated with the OIDC provider. So for this example, my application is on localhost 4200. As mentioned before, every provider configuration will vary. For this example, I'm using OneLogin, and I need to ensure my authentication method is changed from basic to post. So I can do that in the SSO tab. While this is required to change for OneLogin, other providers may already have the authentication method configured properly by default. So I'm going to save my app. Alright, with our application created, it's now time to create some roles. For the OneLogin OIDC provider, a user must carry a role to be associated with an OIDC application. After a role is established, it can be linked to an OIDC app, enabling integration of users assigned to that role into the OIDC application. So let's create a couple of roles that will be used to support different user types. I'm going to create a role called member. And we'll create a second role called admin. Now that our roles are set up, let's create a couple of users that can be associated with our member and admin roles. And we'll give this user a password. And we'll click application here, and we'll select the member role for this user. And now we'll create our second user. Set a password. And this user will be associated with the admin role. So the final step is to map the member and admin role to the OIDC app. So I'm going to navigate back to our OIDC application. We'll click the Access tab, and then we'll select the admin and member role. And after I map my roles, if I go to this User tab, I can see our two users associated with our OIDC application. With all that in place, we are now ready to integrate the OIDC application into our Form.IO project. After the application is created here, it will generate various data points, which will then be stored within the Form.IO project. This process will seamlessly link the OIDC provider with both the Form.IO project and associated application. So for reference, I'm using this OIDC test project for my app, and my OpenID settings can be found in Settings, Authorization, OAuth, and then the OpenID tab. To retrieve the necessary data points, we'll go back to our OIDC application. And the first thing we're going to find is the client ID and secret. So I'm going to go to SSO tab and copy over these credentials. For the remaining data points, navigate to the well-known endpoint for your OIDC application. Regardless of the chosen OIDC provider, each will provide a standardized, well-known endpoint. All of this information can be retrieved from. So the first thing we're going to find is this authorized URI. And I'm going to open up this JSON in my Firefox browser so it's a little bit more organized. And the first thing that we're going to find is the authorized endpoint. And then token URI. Then the user info URI. And for scope, for any of the OIDC providers you might choose, the OpenID and email does need to be included in the scope for the OIDC integration to function properly. Of course, you can always add more to the scope here if needed, especially if you're going to be using claims for roles. But the minimum that is required, again, is OpenID and email. So let's save our settings, and now our project is ready for OIDC authentication for our login forms. The following example will showcase how to configure the Form.IO user login form to support remote OIDC authentication within our application. It's important to note that our Form.IO project has already been integrated with our OIDC application, completed in the previous documentation steps. So be sure to check out that documentation or video if you have not integrated your OIDC provider yet with the Form.IO project. It's also important to note that this workflow is being applied to our client-based application that's connected to this project and not for the portal-based project for our deployed environment. If you are interested in learning how to integrate SSO for your deployed environment, make sure and check out the Portal SSO video linked in the description of this video. All right, we're going to start the workflow out by editing our user login form. And this user login form is embedded into my application and is used to authenticate my user base. Right now, the authentication method for the user login form currently supports resource-based authentication, meaning the login form will search my user resource within the project to verify that data being entered into the email password field matches a record within the resource. To support OIDC remote authentication, however, we need to add a new button to the form, and we'll call that button SSO with OIDC. We're going to change the action to OAuth and then select our OpenID OAuth provider. Let's go ahead and save the form. Next, we're going to add a new action, OAuth, and we're going to select our OpenID provider. For action, we're going to choose remote authentication, since we're authenticating with SSO. We are going to select our SSO with OIDC button. And at this point, we will not delegate any roles. Instead, we will set the role field to authenticate. And this will grant the authenticated role to any OIDC user that authenticates into the application using the SSO method, regardless of what role they might carry from their OIDC provider. So save the action. All right, and the only thing left to do is to test the SSO authentication in our application. So I'm scrolling over to my app. I can see I have the SSO with OIDC button. All right, and that redirects me to my OneLogin authentication page. All right, we can see we are now authenticated as our OIDC user within the application. In many cases, you may want to map the OIDC user role with the Form.IO role. This can be done by enabling the group claim within the OIDC provider scope, and then mapping the OIDC role and Form.IO role within the OAuth action of your authentication form. The claim can be found within the scope of the well-known endpoint. Be sure to reference your OIDC provider documentation on how to enable roles for your users and what claim those roles relate to within the provider scope. We are going to build off the remote authentication SSO workflow example showcased in another tutorial, so check out the description of this video for the link. And before we get started, as a reminder, let's review the roles we have assigned our users within the OIDC application. We've created the member role, which is assigned to OIDC member at example.com. And we've also created the admin role, and that role is assigned to OIDC admin at example.com. Looking at the OneLogin documentation, we can see the OIDC user role information is available within the group claim. In order to enable roles within the scope, we need to make a modification to the OIDC application as shown here. So let's navigate back to our application. And within the parameter tab, we've already made our modifications to support the user role information within the group scope. With our OIDC application ready, there's a couple of modifications we need to make to the Form.IO project. Let's go to our project and open our OAuth settings for OpenID. And we're going to add groups to our scope. Again, groups is the claim that contains the OIDC user role information. I'm going to save that. And with our group claim supported, we can now map our OIDC user roles with Form.IO roles. So we're going to go to our user login form, click Actions, and modify our OAuth action. And we'll scroll down to this Assign Roles settings. Right now, the way this is set up, any OIDC user that logs into our application will contain the authenticated role. For this example, I want OIDC users with the member role to carry the authenticated Form.IO role, and I want the OIDC users with the admin role to carry the administrative Form.IO role. So we're going to add groups to our claims here. And for the value, this is going to be the name of the role for the OIDC user. And I'm going to add one more role here. Again, the claim is going to be groups. The value will be admin, and I want that to map to the administrator role. And we're going to save our action. All right, let's move over to our application. And I'm going to log in with our member user. All right, we can see here we're logged in as the correct user, OIDC member at example.com. And if we look at our dev console and take a look at the user object, we can see the group role member is assigned to the user. And we also have this Form.IO role ID. If I go over here to our project and go to our authenticated role, you can see the ID in the browser here. And if I paste this over, we can see both of those role IDs match. So the user does carry the authenticated role. Now let's go ahead and log out, and we're going to do the same thing except with our OIDC admin user. We're going to click our SSO with OIDC button again. And this time we're going to log in as the admin. All right, and now we're logged in as our OIDC admin. If I do the same thing here, look at my dev console. Take a look at the user object. We can see the group admin role assigned to this user. If I grab the Form.IO role ID, paste this here, we can see the IDs for the admin roles match. So that's how you map OIDC roles with Form.IO roles for granular permissions.